Today I'm talking about some different methods or tips that can be used for helping learning, and these come from a course done online that's free from Coursera.org. Coursera is trying to offer all these courses worldwide that are some of the best of the best, with professors that obviously are good teachers and presenting topics, I assume, in new ways, and bringing learning around the globe and bringing students from all around the globe. And you can take them for free, or you can pay a fee if you want to get a certificate, but they're basically for free. And the certificate cost is pretty low. So as part of that class, we had to do an assignment and teach others what we learned about learning, and so that's what this presentation is for. So Dr. Oakley talked about how many of us, when we're learning a difficult task, are of the opinion that we are supposed to just focus and work on that task until we get it done. Or at least that's the way zombies would do it. I also thought hyper-focused ADHD does it that way. And I am concentrating throughout this presentation on giving you some of my ADHD-isms or ADHD advice, because I think that many people with ADHD are aware of the fact that they learn differently, but I still felt like almost everything that was discussed in class applied, and in fact would probably really help people with ADHD. So often I think in ADHD we are so aware of our troubles with focusing that we think the way to do something is to stay focused, and we want to stay at that until we figure it out. But humans are a lot more complicated than that. One of the things I really liked about this course was that Dr. Oakley had all these great visual aids, and for me, I'm definitely a visual learner, so I have used some of her visual aids because they were so good that I couldn't come up with anything better. So for understanding focused learning, she recommended thinking of it as this pinball machine, and that you fire off an idea that you're working on or a problem, and the pinball goes to the front of the brain, and then it starts bouncing around. And in a focused mode, those bumpers are very close together. Here's a picture showing just that, very close together bumpers. Here, on the other hand, you can see that in the diffuse mode of thinking, the bumpers are much further apart. That's important because on the left side, the solution or the information you need to solve this problem is really in a different part of the brain, and because it gets caught in the front, it can't get past that obstacle to get to the back. On the other hand, if you can switch to diffuse mode and look at the big picture, you'll get to the part of the brain that you need to help find the solution. I think one of the reasons just staying in diffuse mode is so hard for especially ADHD people is that often ADHD people have used procrastination as a tool that helps build up the crisis until their adrenaline can kick in and then put them into hyperfocus. They're wanting to always be in that hyperfocus mode. The problem with that is it's exhausting and can lead, I believe, to adrenal fatigue. A quick side note about adrenal fatigue is our adrenal glands sit above our kidneys, and just like it sounds, the adrenal glands mainly produce adrenaline. Adrenaline is the same thing as epinephrine, and when we're in a crisis, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, and enkephalin and ketamine all pump out and are what enable us to be able to lift the car off of our child if they're underneath the car. Now that may sound like, wow, who doesn't want to be a superhero? But the problem is, if you're always trying to be in superhero mode, we're not superheroes, so eventually you're going to be 1/6 superhero. And I think that happens to a lot of people who've used this method of studying and coping with day-to-day tasks. You can't keep using crisis mode to do your daily tasks, or pretty soon you're going to find yourself sick. Now, as Dr. Oakley pointed out, if you think about Edison and Dolly, you couldn't really picture two more opposite people in their style and sense and their field of expertise, but they actually both used very similar methods for tapping into their diffuse mode of thinking. Salvador Dali, she said, would hold a key, sit down and let himself slowly drift off to sleep, and then as soon as he fell asleep and dropped the key, he would wake up and go back to his project and have the solution. And Thomas Edison actually did the same thing. He would hold ball bearings in his hands and let himself relax, think about his problem, and then when the ball bearings dropped and he was falling asleep, he would go back to the problem. And I figured Dolly was a great example of someone who I bet had ADHD. After all, he didn't seem to be the biggest fan of clocks, or at least he had a strange idea about time. So again, just to reemphasize the importance of planning and spacing out your learning, is that when we try to learn something new, we already know that when we're trying to learn something new physically, like weightlifting or running a marathon, we would never try to lift 1,000 pounds the first time or run a marathon our first time. At least most people wouldn't. But because it takes time, you have to build up slowly. So focusing intently on one session to try to figure something out can be the worst approach possible. You're better off figuring out just pieces of it at a time. As I've already alluded to, all of this brings us to the next topic that's very important for ADHD and learning, and that's procrastination. As this slide shows, this person first is trying to just power through, and smoke is coming out of their ears. So then the brain senses that something uncomfortable is going on, so she begins to daydream, and that helps her cool off or feel better. But this cycle, repeated over and over again, just reinforces procrastination. In other words, that short-term feeling that comes from having put off something that makes us uncomfortable, over time, the long-term effect is negative and can cause depression and anxiety, and obviously all these issues when you're not getting your work done and it's affecting you in other areas. So it comes as no surprise to me, or it is a surprise, but it shouldn't be a surprise, that procrastination shares the same neurobiology as addiction, because addiction is also a short-term reward that you crave and continually want, but the long-term effects are very negative. So a simple technique that can help with procrastination is called the Pomodoro technique. And Pomodoro means tomato in Italian. Or if you want to be an egghead, you could use the egg technique. Really all you need is a timer. Then you clear your mind, your desk, your entire area of distraction. You turn off your cell phone if you're allowed to, assuming you're not a doctor. Turn off your TV and turn the timer to 25 minutes and work on that task. And you don't worry about finishing it, you just work on part of it. If you use this technique and from the beginning start working on your project and don't wait till the end, you're obviously going to get somewhere. Plus, another reason why procrastination is bad is it's been shown that our brain, when we take our time and keep adding new information over time, then has time to build it into a well-organized wall, has time to reorganize, fix things, make new connections. But if we do it all at the last minute, the brain doesn't have time to organize it and reinforce it, and the wall is not properly built. So another concept, which in many ways, at least to me, seems to be the opposite of procrastination, is interleaving. Interleaving is taking time and going from one subject to another, and lays a more solid neural foundation. To explain this better, on the next slide you'll see interleaving is kind of the same idea as shuffling cards. If each of the cards was a different subject, you would go through the cards and then shuffle them and do it again. For students, obviously, this is, for example, like working on all the subjects you're taking every day, even if some days you focus more on one than the others. Or if you're trying to learn one new subject, you spend a little time every day along with your usual tasks. But you identify different parts of the task that you can do at different times. Or you try different approaches or different ways of learning the same material, but you don't just do it one way. This is essentially interleaving. Certainly going from subject to subject may seem very hard, but in the long run, once you get in the habit of it, it really enhances learning. It can build flexibility, creativity, and even though it's difficult at first, you learn your subjects more deeply. If you look at people who are learning two different fields, many times they may have expertise in one field, but as they learn a new field, they bring ideas to that new field that people who've been in that field for a long time never thought of. It also helps by keeping the person from getting stuck in a rut. Dr. Oakley mentioned that most paradigm shifts in science are brought about by either young people or people trained in a different discipline. You also bring to a new field a lack of preconceived notions, or another word for that was Einstellung, which is an obstacle to learning, which often happens when things are in focus mode and the pinball gets stuck at the front of the brain. I think of this similar to the idea that science progresses, or she said, that science progresses one field at a time, and I often have thought myself that cultural changes often require a generation to die off. So another important aspect of dealing with procrastination and interleaving was becoming master of your habits. And habits aren't good or bad, or they can be good or bad, but they are efficient. And so it's a good idea to develop the habit, a good habit, and over time you will become more efficient. For example, Dr. Oakley pointed out that backing out of a driveway you can now do without a lot of thought, but the first time you probably swerved some and had difficulty doing it. So that's an example of a good habit. An example of a bad habit might be that you get into a habit of backing out of the driveway, but you forget to check the street for obstacles and you hit a parked car. So our mind has developed many things that it can do without thinking, and those are what she calls zombies, and they can be used to benefit you or to your demise. The components Dr. Oakley explained to developing a new habit are fourfold. The first is the cue. The cue is what happens that will then in the future trigger the habit, whether the habit's procrastination, which would be a negative habit, or interleaving, which would be a good habit. So the cue, for example, would be negative feelings that you have when you sit down to work on, in my example, I used notes that I'm behind on in the office, or just the notes from that day. So the cue might be, I just can't keep up with these notes. But the routine that I need to establish is to tell myself that every little bit of work counts. Even if I can only get 10 minutes before someone interrupts me, that's 10 more minutes that I wouldn't have had, and 10 more minutes that I can be done sooner at the end of the day. The reward in the past for me was getting caught up, I rewarded myself with some shopping, but I really need to reward myself for staying current instead of getting caught up. So that would be a good thought towards what would make a better reward. And the belief is I have to believe that it's doable. And I didn't used to believe it was doable, but I do now. My last topic that I learned about that I felt actually agreed with a lot of stuff that I've been actually preaching to my husband for 5 years. And I just had to put this in as one of my topics because it was just so nice to now be backed up by experts, because his sleep hygiene and routines are terrible. In fact, one of the big reasons why I signed up for this course was he actually signed up for it first. Well, and I started the course just because he had recommended it. And he had also recommended it to another staff person. And in fact, he recommended it to them. He didn't even, and was just telling me about it. And I said, well, I think I could always improve my learning abilities, skills. I think sometimes people assume that if you have a doctorate that you know everything, but one of the biggest parts of being at the doctorate level, I think, at least for professors and medical doctors, lawyers, those types, is that we never stop learning. We have to keep learning because we're expected to stay on the top of our field. So if I can find ways to improve my learning and be more efficient, I'm all for it. So anyway, back to sleep. I'm always harping on him about sleep because he tends to like to work long hours and skip meals and exercise and even go to bed at a different time every night. And I feel like that in the long run that he actually is less efficient. I've always felt like if he stayed to a routine and would just go to sleep, I suspect that, between 10 o'clock and 2 a.m. that his productivity in those hours is not anything compared to what it would be if he woke up fresh the next day. And I think the next day he might have it all figured out without having to stay up and avoid sleep. But that's an ongoing challenge to get him to believe it, because again, it's hard for him to develop the habit because he lacks the basic belief. But anyway, while we're sleeping, our brain cleans up and gets rid of toxins, and along with that is often little stuff that it feels we don't need to remember. But the bad thing about it is if you're trying to remember something and you've only briefly studied it once that day, you're probably going to next day not remember any of it. So the key to putting down memory permanently is repetition. So sleep not only is important for your other health reasons, but it actually assists memory. It's the time that the brain often processes problems we've been working on and clears stuff out of short-term memory. And if that memory is starting to take root in long-term memory, it will strengthen its permanence there. And it also makes new connections between prior tasks that we've learned and ideas, and helps us look at things in different ways. This all happens while we're sleeping. So I had noticed a long time ago, especially, I first think I noticed it mostly with physical things, like trying to learn a new dance move, or trying to, well, one thing I really noticed about was when I started mountain biking. I noticed that when I first started mountain biking, sometimes like a route I took or a technical thing I did was really hard, but the next time I tried it, it was easy. And there wasn't a lot of, that was even without a lot of repetition in between. It just seemed like if I slept on it, if the next day or so I went and did it again, it was a lot easier. Well, it turns out that that's the case with everything, not just physical things that we learn to do, but problems we try to solve, or when we're trying to create solutions. Our brain reorganizes and reinforces what we're working on while we sleep. So Dr. Oakley said that sometimes, you had to repeat something until you nailed it. But I think, and she even said, and maybe that's the case, where you repeat it multiple times in a day, especially like if you're trying to learn a dance move. And that is true to some degree. But I would argue that if you are stuck or you just can't get it for some reason, all you have to do is wait a day, and the next day you'll get it. So it turns out if you're trying to learn new things like a language or a new subject or a new field, if you work a little bit on it every day, and then even every other day, that type of repetition will really put it down permanently. So this slide shows that little area in the memory is faint on Monday and a little stronger on Tuesday. You work on it again Wednesday and it's even stronger, and then you work on it again Friday and Sunday, and now it's permanent. So that's all the topics that I chose to expound upon or represent from my Coursera course, Learning to Learn, and I hope that was helpful. And if you're interested in taking the full course, I highly recommend it, and you can find it at www.coursera.org. And again, the name of the talk was Learning to Learn. The graphics that were used in this presentation, many of them, especially when you see Dr. Oakley in the picture, are hers, and then the other ones are ones I've purchased and downloaded from Shutterstock. Thanks for listening.